The quiet woman's son was gentle that morning, but the air inside the courtroom was thick and heavy. Every seat was taken, and people leaned forward, their eyes fixed on the lonely figure standing in the center. She was a small woman in her 40s, wearing a faded blue sari, her hands trembling as she held them together. Her name was Meera. Meera was nobody special. She sold vegetables in the market every day, always smiling at customers, always humble. She had a son who studied at the local school and a sick mother she cared for at night. Everyone knew her in the neighborhood as kind and respectful. Someone who never raised her voice. But today, she stood accused of a terrible crime. The judge, a tall man with cold eyes, kept glaring at her like she was already guilty. "You stole government money," he said loudly. "You forged signatures and took bribes. You have betrayed this town," the audience gasped. Meera shook her head. "No, sir," she said softly, almost a whisper. "I did nothing. I only came here because they called me. I don't even understand these papers." The judge slammed his hand on the desk. "Don't lie to me," he shouted. But what no one noticed, sitting quietly at the back, was another man. He wore a simple white shirt and glasses. He had slipped into the room unnoticed, though some people turned to look at him because there was something calm but powerful about him. His name was Sundar Pichai. He watched Meera closely. His eyes softened, and his lips pressed into a thoughtful line. Then the prosecutor stood up. He waved some papers and spoke loudly. "Your Honor, the evidence is clear. This woman is nothing but a cheat. She took money from the poor fund and hid it." "Here's her signature," the crowd murmured. Meera's face turned pale. The judge leaned forward. "If you confess now, I may show mercy," he said. "Otherwise, you will spend many years in prison." Meera's hand shook. Tears ran down her cheeks. But I can't confess to what I didn't do," she said, almost choking on her words. The prosecutor smirked. "That's what they all say." Sundar adjusted his glasses, still sitting quietly, but his gaze never left Meera. Outside the courtroom. A storm began to gather. Rain tapped on the windows, growing louder. Inside, the tension rose like thunder. Then something strange happened. The judge picked up a document and stared at it longer than usual. His hand trembled slightly. Then he looked at Meera with more anger than before. "You should have thought about your family before doing this," he hissed at Meera. Single quotes, knees buckled. But she stayed standing. "I didn't," she whispered. "Please believe me." Just then, Sundar stood up. Everyone turned to look at him. His voice was calm but firm. "Your Honor," he said, "may I speak?" The judge's eyes narrowed. "And who are you?" "Just someone who wants to see the truth," Sundar replied. The judge sneered. "This is not your business. Sit down." But Sundar didn't sit down. He walked slowly toward the front, his steps echoing in the silent room. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a folded piece of paper. "Before you decide her fate," he said, his voice low, but clear, "you should look at this." The judge hesitated. The crowd leaned in closer. Sundar placed the paper on the desk and slid it toward the judge. "I believe this changes everything," he said. The judge picked it up and unfolded it. As his eyes moved over the words, his face darkened, and then, for just a moment, a flash of fear passed over his features. Meera looked confused. The prosecutor frowned. Then the judge crumpled the paper in his fist. Where did you get this?" he demanded. Sundar simply smiled, but his eyes stayed sharp. The judge stood up so quickly his chair tipped over. The room fell into stunned silence. "This court is adjourned until tomorrow," he barked. Then he stormed out, leaving everyone staring after him. Meera sank to the floor, too shocked to speak. Sundar crouched beside her and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're going to be okay," he said softly. "Trust me." But as he stood to leave, a man in a dark suit standing near the door pulled out his phone, dialed a number, and spoke in a low voice. "He's here, and he knows." The man's eyes followed Sundar as he walked out into the rain. And somewhere, far away, another phone began to ring. Asterisk, the storm inside the rain outside had turned into a heavy storm, pounding the streets and rattling the windows of the quiet little courtroom. Sundar stood alone under the awning, his white shirt soaked at the edges. Behind him, the crowd inside was still murmuring, confused and afraid after the judge's sudden departure. The folded paper was no longer on the desk. The judge had snatched it up and fled. Sundar's eyes stayed calm, but inside him, a different storm was already building. He knew this was not just about Meera anymore. This was about something much bigger and much darker than anyone in that room understood yet. As Sundar walked through the rain toward the edge of the town square, he could feel eyes on him. A car was parked near the corner, its engine running. Inside it, a man in a dark suit watched him closely. Sundar didn't look at him, but he noticed everything. The license plate covered with mud, the glint of something metallic on the man's lap, the faint smell of cigarette smoke that carried through the air. The man lifted his phone to his ear, still watching Sundar, and spoke quickly before driving off into the shadows. Sundar stopped for a moment under a street lamp. His mind was already turning over the details. What he'd given the judge was only the beginning. It was a single page from a larger file, something he had discovered months earlier while helping a group of villagers fight a land dispute. The judge's name had appeared again and again, linked to accounts in faraway banks. Signatures that didn't match, properties bought in the names of dead people. But until today, Sundar hadn't realized just how far the judge was willing to go to silence those who stood in his way. Meera was just one more innocent person caught in his net. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a second folded paper, a copy of what he'd given the judge. He stared at it for a long time, rain dripping from his fingers. Then he slipped it back into his pocket and began walking again. The streets were almost empty now. The storm kept most people indoors. Only a few shopkeepers stood at their doors, watching him silently as he passed. He saw fear in their eyes too, and something else. Hope, faint but alive, like a weak flame struggling against the wind. When Sundar reached Meera's house, he found the door slightly open. Inside, the dim light of a kerosene lamp flickered against the walls. Meera sat on the floor, her back against the wall, her hands still trembling. Her son, a boy of about 12, was curled up next to her, trying to comfort her without really understanding what was happening. Sundar removed his shoes at the door and stepped inside quietly. Meera looked up at him with red, swollen eyes. "What did you do in there?" she asked in a cracked voice. "What did you give him?" "Now they'll only come after me harder." Sundar knelt beside her. His voice was soft but steady. "No, Meera, you have nothing to fear. What I gave him? It's enough to stop him if we move quickly. But you must trust me. No matter what you hear tomorrow, don't lose hope." She shook her head slowly. "You don't understand, my son, my mother. If something happens to them because of..." Her voice trailed off and she buried her face in her hands. Sundar placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Nothing will happen to them, I promise you. But tonight, I need to leave for a while. There are people I must speak to before tomorrow." The boy looked up at him with wide eyes. "Will you make them leave my Amma alone?" Sundar gave him a faint smile. "Yes, and one day you will see her smile again." He stood, nodded at Meera, and left without another word. Outside, the rain still fell in thick sheets, soaking him to the bone. But he didn't care. His path was clear now. His first stop was a small tea shop at the edge of town. The shop was closed, but Sundar knocked on the side door until an old man opened it, squinting through the darkness. When he saw Sundar, he let him in quickly and bolted the door behind him. They sat at a small table, and Sundar laid out copies of the documents he had gathered. The old man's hand shook as he turned the pages. "Do you know what this means?" The old man whispered. "If you go through with this, he won't just come for her. He'll come for you too." "I know," Sundar replied calmly. "But if I don't, many more like her will suffer. I need your help. I need the real account books." The old man nodded after a long pause. They are hidden in the back room of the courthouse. But they're locked. Only the clerk has the key. Then I need to speak to the clerk, Sundar said. The old man lowered his voice even further. Be careful. He's loyal to the judge. Or at least, he was. But I heard something. His own brother was sent away years ago by the judge. Maybe. He will listen to you? Sundar left the tea shop and headed toward the clerk's house. The rain had lightened to a drizzle, but the streets were still slick and empty. He could feel the tension in the air, like the moment just before lightning strikes. When he reached the clerk's house, he knocked softly. No one answered. He knocked again. Finally, the door creaked open a few inches, and a nervous face peered out. I need to talk to you, Sundar said quietly. It's about Meera. The clerk hesitated, then opened the door fully and let Sundar inside. The house smelled of damp wood and faint smoke. They sat at a small table, and Sundar spoke plainly. You know what the judge has been doing, Sundar began. You know she's innocent. You know what's hidden in that back room. The clerk looked down at his hands, silent for a long time. Then he finally spoke. Why are you doing this? You're not from here. You could just walk away. Sundar's voice stayed calm, but his eyes were steady. Because no one else will. And because if we don't stop him now, more lives will be destroyed. The clerk closed his eyes for a moment, then nodded slowly. I'll help you, he whispered, but it has to be tonight. If they find out tomorrow, it'll be too late. They agreed to meet behind the courthouse at midnight. Sundar left the house and melted back into the darkness, but as he rounded the corner, he stopped. Cold. Two men stood blocking the alleyway ahead. Both wore dark coats, their faces shadowed, but Sundar recognized one of them from the car earlier. The man in the middle flicked a knife open with a soft click. You've made a mistake, the man said, his voice low and dangerous. You should have left town when you had the chance. Sundar said nothing. He took a slow step back, but another man appeared behind him, cutting off his escape. The first man stepped closer, the blade glinting faintly in the streetlight. You're not going to the courthouse tonight, the man continued. You're not going anywhere. Sundar's mind raced. He glanced at the walls around him, the narrowness of the alley, the slick stones beneath his feet. His heartbeat quickened, but his face remained calm. The second man reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy chain, letting it swing from his hand. We'll make it quick, he said with a sneer. The rain began to fall harder again, drumming against the stones and filling the silence between them. Sundar took another step back, his eyes sharp. Waiting, and then, without warning, he moved. He kicked at a loose stone on the ground, sending it skidding into the first man's knee. The man stumbled, cursing, and Sundar darted forward, knocking the knife from his hand and pushing him into the wall. The second man swung the chain wildly, but Sundar ducked, grabbed it, and yanked it free. For a moment, the alley was a blur of motion, feet slipping on wet stones, fists striking out, rain spraying in every direction. Sundar moved like someone who had been here before, fast and precise. Within seconds, both men were on the ground, groaning, and Sundar stood over them, breathing hard. He dropped the chain and stepped back, his hands steady again. Tell him, he said softly, that I'm not afraid. Then he turned and walked away into the rain, leaving the two men lying in the alley behind him. But as he disappeared into the night, a figure watched him from a nearby rooftop, a tall man in a long coat, his face hidden in shadow. He raised a phone to his ear and spoke quietly. He survived, the figure said, but he won't survive the next one. The shadow plant clock above the courthouse struck midnight, each chime echoing through the empty square like a warning. The rain had slowed, but the air was still heavy, thick with the smell of wet stone and something darker, fear. Sundar stood in the shadows behind the courthouse, his back pressed to the cold wall, waiting. In his chest, his heart beat steady, but his mind was sharp, watching, calculating. Every crack in the stones, every faint sound of movement reached him like a whisper. He glanced toward the old wooden door at the back of the building, the one the clerk had promised to open. But it remained closed. The courtyard was silent, except for the soft splash of raindrops in the puddles around his feet. Sundar's eyes swept the windows above. Dark. No lights. No sign of life. But he could feel it. The eyes. Someone was watching. He thought about Meera. About the fear on her face, the weight in her shoulders, the silent tears she tried to hide from her son. That image hardened something in him, quiet but unshakable. He wasn't here for himself. He wasn't here for revenge. He was here because no one else would stand for her, and for everyone like her at last. The door creaked open just a sliver. A faint beam of light spilled out, thin and nervous. Sundar slipped through quickly. Inside, the smell of dust and ink filled his nose. The clerk stood waiting, his thin hands clutching a heavy ring of keys. His face was pale, his eyes darting around the dark room. "You came," the clerk whispered, as though surprised. "You said you'd help." Sundar replied calmly. The clerk nodded quickly, his breath shallow. I have the books." But he hesitated, glancing toward the corridor beyond. "Someone else is here tonight. I saw him when I came in. Tall man. Coat, didn't see his face, but he didn't belong here." Sundar's jaw tightened. He already knew. "The man from the rooftop. Show me," Sundar said quietly. The clerk led him down a narrow hallway, their footsteps muffled on the old carpet. At the end of the corridor was a small locked door. The clerk fumbled with the keys, finally unlocking. Inside was a storage room lined with shelves, papers stacked in uneven piles, boxes with faded labels. The clerk moved quickly to the back and pulled out a hidden drawer beneath one of the shelves. He lifted out 2 heavy ledgers bound in dark leather and placed them on the table. "Everything is here," he murmured. "Names, dates, amounts." He's been stealing from everyone for years. "This isn't just about Meera. This is bigger than her. Bigger than you and me. You understand?" Sundar opened the first book, flipping through the pages. His eyes scanned the columns of numbers and signatures, page after page of lies and theft. He felt a chill pass through him as he realized just how deep the judge's corruption ran. It wasn't just money, it was land, lives, futures. The weight of so many people's suffering lay between those covers, but then a sound behind them froze the room, the soft click of a door shutting somewhere down the hall. Sundar closed the book quietly and slid it under his arm. His eyes met the clerk's. "Stay here," he said simply. He stepped out into the corridor, every sense alert. The air felt colder now, and the faint smell of cigarette smoke hung in the hallway. He moved silently toward the faint sound of footsteps. Ahead, as he turned the corner, he saw him, the tall man in the long coat, standing at the end of the corridor, just beyond the faint circle of light. His face still hidden in shadow, only a sharp outline visible. His hands were in his pockets, and his head tilted slightly as if in amusement. "You're persistent," the man said softly, his voice calm and low. Sundar didn't answer. He just watched, waiting. "You should have left when you had the chance," the man continued. "But now it's too late. You've seen too much, and you've made him nervous." "Good," Sundar replied. Evenly, the man let out a small laugh. Then, without another word, he turned and walked into the darkness, his footsteps fading. Sundar followed, his own steps quick but quiet. He turned another corner, then stopped abruptly. The corridor was empty. The man was gone, but there, on the floor, lay a folded piece of paper. Sundar knelt and picked it up. Written in neat, dark ink were just 5 words. "She won't see tomorrow." Dahi stared at the words for a long moment. Then he folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his pocket. When he returned to the storage room, the clerk was waiting, his face pale. "Who was it?" the clerk asked. "Someone who thinks he can scare me," Sundar said. His voice was steady, but inside he felt the weight of the threat pressing down on him. He handed the clerk one of the ledgers. "Keep this safe," Hide it where no one can find it. I'll take the other. The clerk hesitated. What are you going to do? Sundar looked him in the eyes. I'm going to finish this. He slipped out of the courthouse the same way he had entered into the cold night air, but as he stepped back into the square, he stopped. The lights in Meera's house were on. Too bright. Too many figures moving inside. His heart dropped. He ran. The wet stone slipped under his feet as he crossed the square, his breath sharp in his chest. He reached the door and pushed it open. Inside, the room was in chaos. Meera stood pressed against the wall, her son clinging to her leg, crying. Two men in dark coats stood in the middle of the room, one holding a heavy stick, the other rifling through drawers and boxes, throwing papers and clothes to the floor. Where is it? One of them barked at her. We know he left it here. Where is it? Meera shook her head, terrified. I don't know what you're talking about, she cried. The man raised the stick, and in that instant, Sundar moved. He stepped into the room, his voice sharp. Stop. Both men turned, startled. But only for a second. The one with the stick sneered and took a step toward him. You should have stayed away, he said. Sundar didn't flinch. His eyes flicked to the boy, then back to the men. Leave, he said quietly. This is your last chance. The man laughed. Or what? What happened next happened fast. A blur of movement, a sharp crash as the stick hit the floor, a grunt of pain. The two men stumbling backward, stunned. Sundar stood between them and Meera, his breath steady, his eyes like steel. The taller man clutched his arm where Sundar had struck him. And for the first time, Sundar saw fear in his eyes. Tell him, Sundar said calmly. I'm not afraid of you, and tomorrow everyone will know the truth. The two men hesitated, then backed toward the door. They slipped out into the night without another word. Meera sank to the floor, clutching her son, her whole body trembling. Sundar knelt beside her, his hand light on her shoulder. They won't hurt you again, he said softly, but inside his mind was already turning, already planning. This wasn't just about a courtroom anymore. This was about exposing everything, no matter the cost. He stood, glancing out the window at the dark street beyond. Somewhere out there, the man in the coat was watching, waiting. And somewhere beyond him, the judge was already preparing his next move. Asterisk, breaking point, first rays of dawn slept through the curtains, pale and fragile, as if afraid to touch the floor of Meera's small house. Sundar sat at her kitchen table, unmoving, the judge's red ink message lying in front of him. The words court resumed at noon. Bring the book. Urshid's eyes glared up at him like a wound that refused to heal. He hadn't slept. He hadn't even closed his eyes. Instead, he'd spent the entire night turning the paper over and over in his hand, weighing each possible move, each risk, each possible outcome. Meera sat in the corner with her son curled against her lap. Her hands moved absently over the boy's hair, but her eyes stayed fixed on Sundar. There was no more fear in her face now, just quiet despair. She already seemed resigned to what would come. Sundar watched her for a long time before finally speaking, his voice rough but steady. We are not going to give him what he wants, he said. We're going to finish this. She shook her head faintly. You don't understand. He has people everywhere. Even if you take it to the court, they'll find some way to stop you. You can't fight him. Sundar's lips tightened. I can. And I will. Outside, the town square was already beginning to stir. Shopkeepers swept water from their steps. Children ran barefoot through puddles, and neighbors whispered to one another in low, anxious tones. Everyone had heard about what had happened yesterday in the courtroom. The judge's sudden retreat, the stranger who stood up for a poor woman no one else dared to defend, and the two men who limped away from Meera's house in the middle of the night. But something else was growing too. A quiet courage. A feeling that maybe, just maybe, the judge's power was not as unshakable as it seemed. At 10 o'clock, Sundar left the house, the ledger wrapped tightly in brown cloth under his arm. He walked toward the square with long, steady steps. But he wasn't alone. Behind him, at first just a handful of people followed. Shopkeepers, a few neighbors, curious children clinging to their mothers' skirts. Then more joined, and more. By the time he reached the courthouse steps, dozens of townspeople stood behind him, their eyes bright with something between fear and defiance. Sundar paused at the foot of the courthouse. Then he turned to face them. For the first time, he spoke to them all. "You all know what he has done to her," he began, his voice clear but not loud. "And to so many of you, you've lived under his shadow for years, afraid to speak, afraid to look him in the eye. But today you have a choice. You can stay silent, or you can stand with me." The crowd murmured, shifting uneasily. But one old woman in the front, her back bent, her hands rough from years of labor, stepped forward. "We'll stand," she said, simply. Then another, and another, until nearly all of them stood, shoulder behind him. At noon. The courtroom was packed. The judge entered through a side door, his black robe stiff, his face an unreadable mask. But Sundar noticed the faint tremor in his hands as he adjusted his glasses. The prosecutor stood at his side, his own expression tight and wary. Sundar stepped forward, the ledger under his arm. "Your Honor," he began, "before we continue with this trial, there is evidence that must be entered into the record." Judge's eyes narrowed. "What evidence?" he asked, though his voice cracked slightly. Sundar laid the ledger on the table and opened it to the marked page. "This book contains proof of every theft, every false signature, every name you've destroyed to build your fortune. And Meera's name is not among them." The courtroom erupted into whispers. The judge slammed his gavel. "Silence," he roared. But there was a faint sheen of sweat on his forehead now. Before he could speak again, a door at the back of the courtroom opened. Everyone turned as a small, timid figure entered. The clerk. He walked slowly to the front, his hand shaking but his chin held high. "I can confirm," he said in a quivering voice, "that the ledger is real. I saw him falsify the records with my own eyes. I saw him forge names. Mine is there too. But it wasn't me, it was him." The judge's face turned pale, then red. He shot to his feet. "Liar," he bellowed. "You're all liars?" But the prosecutor, standing quietly at his side, took a step back. His expression had changed, no longer wary but thoughtful. Then he cleared his throat. "Your Honor," he said, almost reluctantly, "we should consider this evidence seriously. If the ledger is real, then enough." The judge shouted, slamming the gavel so hard it cracked. His composure was slipping. The crowd's whispers rose louder, and someone in the back shouted, "Shame." The judge turned on Sundar, his eyes wild. "You think you can come into my court and humiliate me? You think you can turn this town against me? You know nothing? Nothing." But Sundar remained calm. "I know enough," he said. Softly. The judge stood still for a long moment, his chest rising and falling heavily. Then, without warning, he lunged toward Sundar, grabbing the ledger and tearing at its pages. "You will not destroy me," he hissed, his voice breaking. But before he could tear the book, the townspeople surged forward. The old woman who had spoken earlier stepped between Sundar and the judge, her frail hands outstretched. Others joined her, forming a wall of bodies. Between them, the judge froze, suddenly realizing how many eyes were on him now. Not afraid, but angry. He stumbled backward, his face pale. "This isn't over," he muttered. Then he turned sharply and stormed toward his chambers. Just as Sundar began to breathe again, a gasp rippled through the crowd. He spun around and saw Meera standing near the doorway, her hands clutching her stomach, her face drained of all color. Then she collapsed. The room erupted in confusion as people rushed to her side. Sundar dropped to his knees next to her, his hand finding hers. Her breathing was shallow, her skin clammy. "Get a doctor," he ordered, his voice tight. But as he looked into her eyes, he saw something in them, not just fear this time, but a strange sadness, as if she already knew something he didn't. And somewhere in the corner of the room, a shadow slipped quietly out the back door, unseen. But not unnoticed. Asterisk, the final truth air outside the hospital was thick and unmoving, as though even the wind refused to pass through this place. Sundar stood beneath the dim yellow light of a street lamp, his hands shoved into his pockets, his shirt damp with sweat and rain. Inside, beyond the cold glass doors, doctors moved quickly through shadowy corridors, but no one had come to him yet. No one had said if Meera would live. The memory of her collapse played over and over in his mind, the way her hands shook. Before slipping from his, the faint whisper of his name on her lips before her eyes fluttered shut. He had felt helpless then, and he hated it, but he wasn't helpless now. He unfolded the piece of paper that had been slipped into his hand just minutes ago. The words were written in tight, sharp letters that looked almost like scratches. The judge has called for someone worse than him. If you value her life, leave this town before nightfall. The words did not frighten him. But they did something else. They hardened something inside him. If the judge thought this would break him, if he thought this would scare him into silence, then he didn't understand Sundar at all. He looked up as the hospital door opened and the clerk hurried out. His face was pale and drawn, his eyes darting nervously from shadow to shadow. He stopped a few feet away, catching his breath. "She's stable for now," the clerk said softly. "But she may not wake up tonight." Sundar nodded slowly. His fingers tightened around the paper. "He's getting desperate," the clerk continued. "The way he stormed out of the courtroom. I've never seen him like that. They say he locked himself in his chambers and made a call. No one knows who. But I heard a name." "Whose?" Sundar asked, his voice quiet. The clerk swallowed. "Hard, they call him Malik." The name hung between them like a blade. Sundar had heard it before, whispered in villages, scrawled on walls that were later painted over, spoken only when no one else was listening. Malik was not a man who simply followed orders. "He finished things. He's coming tonight," the clerk whispered. "If you stay, you won't make it to morning." But Sundar only shook his head. "If I leave," he said softly, "then nothing changes. Meera still suffers. The others still live in fear. And more will come after her. No, I won't leave." The clerk looked at him for a long moment, then lowered his gaze. "Then God help you," he murmured. And then he slipped back into the shadows. Sundar stood there for a few more minutes, feeling the weight of what was to come settle on his shoulders like a storm cloud. Then he straightened, turned on his heel, and walked toward the courthouse. Courthouse was quiet when he arrived, but the heavy wooden doors stood open, and a faint light flickered inside. Sundar stepped into the main chamber. The judge sat at his bench, his robes gone, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his face slick with sweat. He was not the same man who had commanded the room yesterday. His hand shook as he shuffled papers on the desk, his eyes darting to the door when he saw Sundar enter. "You should have left," the judge said, his voice hoarse. "You could have walked away, but you're still here." "Why?" "Because you don't deserve to win," Sundar answered. Simply. The judge let out a hollow laugh, though there was no humor in it. "You think you've already won? You think those people out there will save you? They're afraid of me?" "They've always been afraid of me. They'll forget you tomorrow." Sundar shook his head. "Not this time." "You don't understand." The judge continued, leaning forward, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. "You've stirred something you don't even see yet. Malik is coming, and when he does, he won't just take you. He'll take everyone. Who stood with you? He'll make sure no one even remembers your name." Sundar took a step closer. "Then he should hurry," he said quietly. "Because I'm not leaving." Just then, a door slammed somewhere deep in the building. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, began to echo through the halls. The judge's face broke into a strained, nervous smile. "There," he whispered. "He's here." The footsteps grew louder. And then the figure appeared in the doorway. Malik was taller than Sundar had expected, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark overcoat, his face hidden in shadow. But it wasn't just his size. It was the way. He carried himself, calm, patient, like a man who had done this many times before and never once failed. He stopped just inside the room, his eyes finding Sundar. You've caused a lot of trouble. Malik said softly, his voice low and smooth. Sundar stood his ground. Not enough yet, he replied. Malik's lips curved into a faint smile. Then he reached into his coat and slowly pulled out a gun. The judge leaned back in his chair, watching like a man who knew how this would end up, but Sundar didn't move. He met Malik's eyes without flinching. If you shoot me now, he said, the ledger still goes public tomorrow. Everything still comes out, so go ahead, pull the trigger. But you won't stop the truth. Malik's smile faded slightly. For the first time, he hesitated. Then a noise from the doorway behind them. Another figure stepped in. It was the prosecutor. His face was tight with something that looked almost like shame. In his hands, he held a stack of papers. He's right, the prosecutor said loudly, his voice carrying through the chamber. The evidence is already filed. I filed it myself. The judge shot to his feet. What are you doing? He roared. The prosecutor ignored him. It's over, he said simply. You can't stop this now. Malik turned his head toward the judge. And for the first time, Sundar saw it. Just a flicker, but it was there. Malik's loyalty wasn't to the judge. It was to the money. And if the judge couldn't pay any more, Malik lowered the gun. You've wasted my time, he muttered to the judge. Then he slipped the weapon back into his coat and walked out without another word. The judge stood frozen, his face pale and furious. Sundar stepped forward, laying the ledger on the desk in front of him. You've taken enough from these people, he said softly. Today it ends. The judge sank into his chair, his hands trembling. His eyes darted around the room, as if looking for some last way out. But there was none. Just then, a loud crash rang out from outside the courthouse. Shouts, footsteps. The townspeople had gathered. They were coming in, their voices rising in anger. The judge pressed back in his chair, his breath quickening doubt, and then a final noise cut through the chaos. The courthouse doors slammed open again, and Meera appeared. She stood in the doorway, her face pale but determined, her hands clutching the frame for balance. Sundar turned, his breath catching at the sight of her. But before anyone could speak, another sound stopped them all. The click of a hammer being drawn back. A masked figure stood just inside the room, his gun aimed straight at Sundar. Asterisk redemption. Air in the courtroom went still. No one moved. No one breathed. The masked figure stood rigid, his gun raised, the barrel pointing straight at Sundar's chest. The crowd behind Sundar froze in the doorway, packed shoulder to shoulder, their whispers dying in their throats. Meera clung to the doorframe, her face pale, her knuckles white where she held on, every ounce of her strength holding her upright. Sundar stood alone, calm, unflinching, his eyes locked on the black holes of the mask in front of him. And then, from somewhere unseen, from the far corner of the room, where shadows pooled and no one had looked, a single word cut through. The silence like a blade. Enough. The voice was sharp, steady, unmistakable. The masked figure froze. His finger lingered over the trigger for a breath longer. Then he slowly lowered the gun. His shoulders dropped slightly as he turned toward the shadows. From the darkness stepped Malik. His heavy coat swayed as he moved into the light, his eyes fixed on the masked man. His voice came low and deliberate. We don't shoot dead men. Walking, Malik said. And that's where he is now. Dead. Just doesn't know it yet. The masked man hesitated for a long moment, then finally tucked the gun back under his jacket and stepped aside. Sundar stayed where he was, silent but watchful, his hands still at his sides. Malik's eyes met Sundar's. You're clever, he said. I'll give you that. Most people would have run. But you kept walking into the fire? Because I don't burn so easily, Sundar replied softly. A faint smirk tugged at the corner of Malik's mouth. He gave a small nod, then turned his back on the judge, who still sat behind the bench, trembling. You don't pay me anymore, Malik said to the judge, his voice now sharp and cold. And you're not worth the trouble. And just like that, Malik walked out, the masked figure trailing behind him without a word. The door shut. The echo rang out like a final verdict in the stunned quiet that followed. The townspeople began to move. Slowly at first, then with growing certainty, they stepped farther into the room. Their voices rose, not whispers now, but anger, defiance. One by one, they surrounded the judge's bench. Their eyes hard and unforgiving. The judge tried to stand, but found himself backed against the chair, cornered by the very people he had once ruled over. His voice broke as he finally spoke. You can't, he stammered. I built this town. You need me? But no one believed him anymore. Meera stepped forward, still leaning on the doorframe, her strength returning with each breath. Her eyes, once full of fear, now burned with quiet fury. She raised her chin and spoke. You tried to break me. She said, you tried to take everything, but you failed? Because you never understood, people like me, we don't stop. We don't break. The crowd murmured their agreement, louder now, filling the room. Sundar finally stepped forward, placing the ledger firmly on the desk in front of the judge. His voice was calm, but unyielding. You've stolen enough. From them, from her, from everyone. This is over. The judge collapsed into his chair, his head in his hands. Defeated at last, the prosecutor moved quickly, signaling two policemen to come forward. They pulled the judge to his feet, placed cold iron cuffs on his wrists, and began to lead him away. The crowd parted just enough to let him pass, but no one moved aside for him with respect. Instead, they glared at him with a kind of quiet triumph. Meera finally let go of the doorframe and stepped fully into the room. Sundar reached out instinctively, steadying her. She leaned on him for a moment, and in her eyes he saw something he hadn't seen before. Gratitude, and something even deeper. Thank you, she whispered. He shook his head slightly. You don't have to thank me, he said. You stood up for yourself. I just stood next to you. Behind them, the townspeople began to cheer. Not wildly, but steady, strong, full of relief and hope. It was the sound of a town waking up after a long nightmare. Hours later, when the sun was high and the square was full of light again, Sundar and Meera walked out of the courthouse together. Her son ran up to her and threw his arms around her waist, laughing through tears. She hugged him tightly, her face pressed into his hair. The crowd followed them out, their voices bright now, their heads held higher. The old woman from before shuffled up to Sundar and laid a hand on his arm. You gave us our voices back, she said simply. Sundar smiled faintly. You already had them, he replied. You just forgot how loud they could be. He looked around the square one last time, at the bright morning light spilling over the rooftops, at the people who now stood a little taller, at Meera and her boy walking ahead of him. And then he turned and began walking toward the edge of town, his steps quiet but certain. He did not look back. He didn't need to. He knew they would be all right now. Asterisk.